You're at a dinner party. 6 people at the table, someone says something offhand, a small dig, not even aimed at you, and you feel the temperature of the whole room shift before anyone else has registered it. You catch the micro flinch on the host's face. You hear the pause before the next sentence. You've already mapped 3 ways to redirect the conversation before your fork hits the plate. Everyone else is still eating. You're doing air traffic control. That's the thing I want to talk about. I'm Frank, and if you're a gay man somewhere between 45 and 60, what I just described is a nervous system that got built a long time ago, doing exactly what it was trained to do. The people around you call you sensitive, or intense, or too much, or, if they like you, perceptive. What's actually happening under the hood is more interesting than any of those words, and the research on it is recent enough that even your therapist might not have caught up. Here's the setup. You were a kid in the 70s and 80s. You learned to scan a room before you learned to scan a book. Not because you were gifted, because the room could hurt you. A teacher's tone, the way an uncle looked at you a half second too long. Which kid at recess decided today was the day. You weren't being dramatic. You were doing surveillance, and you were good at it because the cost of being wrong was high. Now you're in your 50s. The original threat is mostly gone. The wiring isn't. Let me give you the science, because this isn't vibes. In 1995, a researcher named Meyer published a study in the Journal of Health and Social Behavior. He looked at 741 gay men in New York City and built what's now called minority stress theory. The headline finding, men carrying high minority stress were 2 to 3 times more likely to suffer high psychological distress than men who weren't. 2 to 3 times. That kind of gap means you're running on a different operating system. Meyer split the stress into 2 buckets. Distal stressors, the things that happen to you. Slurs, getting passed over, getting hit, the aunt who stopped calling. Then proximal stressors, the things you do to yourself because of the first bucket. Hiding, scanning, expecting the next rejection before it shows up. Soaking in the message that there's something wrong with you for existing the way you exist. That second bucket is the one that doesn't go away when the laws change. A more recent paper, 2025, in the Journal of Sex Research, basically tested the theory across a stretch from 2009 to 2022. Years when, on paper, things got better. Marriage, visibility, corporate logos in June. And the finding was that the hypervigilance carries forward anyway. The body doesn't get a memo when the Supreme Court rules. The scanning continues. The bracing continues. A 2024 study in Quality and Quantity actually measured this. Vigilance and hypervigilance as a trackable response to anti-gay environments, still showing up in people who, by any external measure, are living free lives now. So that's part 1. You feel everything because part of you is still running threat detection on a network that mostly went quiet 20 years ago. Your amygdala didn't get the update. Here's where it gets weird. You were also a boy, and boys in the 70s and 80s got handed a very specific deal. You do not show feelings. You do not cry. You do not name what's going on inside you. A psychologist named Ronald Levant has spent decades on this. He coined the phrase normative male alexithymia. Alexithymia just means not having words for what you feel. Levant's argument is that for a huge number of men, the condition wasn't born in them. It was trained into them. The research, including a 2025 study in sex roles that ran the test on 740 men in the US and UK, confirms the pathway. The more you absorb the masculine code, the less access you have to your own emotional vocabulary, and the more you end up with anxiety and depression you can't quite explain. Levant's work shows the deficit is sharpest exactly where it hurts most: vulnerability and attachment, love and need. The two things gay men spent a long time being told they weren't allowed to want out loud. Sit with the contradiction for a second. You were trained by virtue of being a gay kid in a dangerous room to feel everything, to read the smallest signal, to track 6 people's moods at once, to notice what nobody else noticed. And you were trained by virtue of being a boy to name none of it. Feel like a radar dish. Speak like a brick wall. That's an architecture. And it's what produces the man I'm describing. The one at the dinner party who's running emotional simulations on the whole table and would rather chew glass than say, "That comment hurt me." Now layer one more thing on top, because if you've ever read an article about being a highly sensitive person and rolled your eyes, give me a minute. A researcher named Elaine Aron started studying something called sensory processing sensitivity in 1990. Real construct, real scale, real peer-reviewed body of work. Her estimate, and it's held up across decades, is that around 15 to 20% of the general population is wired this way. Deeper processing of input, stronger reactions to beauty and to ugliness, easier overstimulation, more empathy as a baseline trait, not a learned skill. Aaron's research isn't about gay men specifically. The trait shows up across every demographic. But think about what happens when you take a kid who's already in that 15 to 20%, already processing more than the kid next to him, and you drop him into the gay boy in 1978 obstacle course. The hypervigilance from minority stress lands on top of a nervous system that was already turned up louder than average. You don't get one signal, you get a stack. This is part of why 2 gay men can grow up in the same town, in the same year, and one ends up running a hedge fund while the other can't get through a Pixar movie without crying in the bathroom. Same era, same pressure, different baseline hardware. The HSP guy got the full treatment. I want to pause on something before we go further, because there's a temptation here to read all this as damage. Hypervigilance, alexithymia, sensitivity, stacked on stress. Sounds like a list of injuries. It's also where the taste came from. The man who reads a room in 2 seconds is the man who can decorate one. The man who tracks micro-expressions is the man who can write dialogue, run a classroom, run a hospice floor, run a department, throw a dinner that people talk about for a year. The depth of feeling that looks like a wound when you're 15 is the same depth that makes you the friend people call when their mother dies. There's a reason so many gay men of your generation ended up in the work that requires this exact equipment. Design, medicine, teaching, the arts, therapy, anything where you have to actually see other people. You were calibrated for it. The same nervous system that hurt you trained you. Both things are true. Hold both. Okay, let's talk about Alan Downs for a minute, because if you've been in any gay friend group for the last 20 years, his book has come up. The Velvet Rage. Came out in 2005, revised in 2012. Downs is a psychologist, and his argument is that the core psychological problem of gay male life comes down to the shame that got soaked into you before you had any defense against it. He maps 3 stages. Stage 1, you're drowning in shame and don't know it. Stage 2, you compensate. The body, the career, the apartment, the achievements, the perfect calendar, the laugh that's a little too loud at the right parties. You become impressive so you can't be rejected. Stage 3, if you're lucky and you do the work, you stop performing and start actually living. What I want to add to Downs because his framework is useful, but it's been around 20 years and the research has moved, is that the compensation stage runs deeper than psychology. It's physiological. The reason you can't stop achieving, can't stop curating, can't stop tracking comes down to a nervous system that learned very early that being unimpressive was unsafe. A 2023 update to minority stress theory and PMC makes this explicit. The where shows up in the body. Stress responses, long-term load, the body keeps the contract long after the mind would like to renegotiate, which brings us to right now, your 50s. And the part of this that I think doesn't get talked about enough because it's the quietest and the most expensive. There's a 2025 study in the journal Healthcare on depressive symptoms in older gay men. They built a regression model and tested every variable they could think of. Ageism, internalized homophobia, health behavior, the works. One variable explained more of the depression than any other: loneliness. Present in the model and dominant. The full model accounted for about 83% of the variance in depressive symptoms, and loneliness was the single largest driver. Bigger than internalized homophobia, bigger than ageism, bigger than physical health. And here's the comparison that lands. Research summarized in that same review found older LGB adults are roughly 1.5 to 2 times more likely to experience loneliness than straight people the same age. Pair that with work showing older gay and bisexual men are less likely to have children and more likely to live alone than their straight peers. Add Cochrane and May's work on mental disorders among LGB adults. Gay and bisexual men show higher rates of major depression and panic disorder than straight men, and they use mental health services at much higher rates. Read that again. Gay men of your cohort have been in therapy at notably higher rates than the straight men around them. You did the work, you read the books, you sat in the chair, and the loneliness still shows up in the data as the biggest predictor of how you feel. Why? Because therapy can rewire a lot. It can't manufacture a Tuesday night phone call from someone who's known you for 30 years. It can't make a chosen family appear when half of yours moved away or moved on or just got quieter. It can't fill a kitchen. So here's the picture. The man who feels everything deeply is a man whose nervous system was tuned in childhood to scan for threat, whose emotional vocabulary was clipped at the root by the era he was born into, who may also have been born with a baseline sensitivity that 80% of the population doesn't share, who built a life of compensation that worked for a couple of decades, and who is now sitting in a quieter house than he expected at this age, with a feeling he can register but still struggles to name. If you recognize yourself in any of that, I want to say something carefully. The depth of feeling was never the problem. What got left out was permission to point it inward. You can read a friend in 7 seconds, and you can't tell yourself you're tired until you're on the floor with the flu. You can name what your sister needs from a holiday dinner, and you can't name what you needed from your mother. The signal is fine. The signal is excellent. It just keeps pointing outward. The fix, if you want to call it that, has nothing to do with feeling less. You can't. The wiring is the wiring at this point, and frankly, the world is better with people in it who feel this much. The move is to start aiming the radar at yourself with the same precision you've been spending on everyone else for 40 years. Notice that the tightness in your chest at 4 p.m. has a story. Notice when the third glass of wine has stopped being relaxation and started being a volume knob. Notice that you've been fine for 6 weeks, and fine has started to mean nothing. And this is the loneliness piece, and it's the hardest one. Treat your friendships like infrastructure. the way you'd treat a roof. You wouldn't let a roof go 30 years without maintenance. A lot of men your age have let the friendships go that long, and then wonder why the house feels cold. The data is brutally clear on this. Of all the things you can do for your mental health in this decade of your life, the one with the biggest return is not letting the people who know you drift out of regular contact. Not a text. A real call. A real meal. A real Tuesday. One last thing, because I think it matters. You spent a lot of your early life being told in 100 small ways that what you felt was wrong or too much or embarrassing or dangerous. A whole generation of gay men carries the residue of that around like a low hum nobody else can hear. The cruel joke is that the very thing they tried to train out of you is the thing that made you good at being alive. The empathy, the taste, the eye, the way you can be in a room with someone who's grieving and not need to fix it. The way you notice the light. That's the equipment. They just never told you it was equipment. They told you it was a liability, and you believed them, and you spent a few decades apologizing for the best part of yourself. You can stop now. The room is safer than it used to be. The scanning can ease up. And the depth was always going to be there. Might as well aim it at something good, starting with the man holding it. Before you click off, let me sit on top. One more thing, because I rushed past it, and it deserves a minute of its own. The Cochrane data. Gay and bisexual men in that sample used mental health services at substantially higher rates than straight men. That gap is enormous, and people usually read it one of two ways. Either gay men are sicker, or gay men are more willing to ask for help. Both readings miss the more interesting one. You went to therapy because you had to develop a relationship with your own interior that the men around you never had to develop. A straight guy in 1985 could go his whole life without ever being asked to examine why he was the way he was. The culture handed him a script, and as long as he stuck to it, nobody made him explain himself. You didn't get that. You had to construct an identity from scratch in private, usually starting around age 11, with a lot of static and very little signal. By the time you were 30, you'd done more internal work than most of your straight male coworkers would do in a lifetime. The therapy stat reads as proof that you were a builder, and that builder is still in there. He's the reason this video makes sense to you instead of sounding like a foreign language. Most men your age can't sit through 10 minutes of someone naming what's happening inside them. You can. That's a skill, and it's rare, and you earned it the hard way. So when you take stock of where you are right now, the quiet house, the friends you've been meaning to call, the feeling you still can't quite put a word on, give yourself credit for the part you don't usually count. You're a man who can hear himself think. A lot of guys in your demographic literally cannot. They've been static their whole lives, and they're going to die static. You're not. The work from here isn't more excavation. You've excavated. The basement is clean. The work from here is use. Pointing the equipment at your own life with the same generosity you've been pointing it at everyone else's. Calling the friend. Saying the true sentence at the dinner instead of running air traffic control over it. Letting somebody read your room for a change. The feeling everything part is permanent. The being alone with it part doesn't have to be. That's the only real distinction left to make in this decade, and it's the one nobody handed you, because nobody before you got here in the shape you're in. All right, go watch the one on the screen. I think it's the right one for you.